Dirty Politics, Hard Times, a Trilogy of Chartism, Book 3, Daniel Akroyd's Revenge. Chapter 3, Continued. "Daniel!" The lad looked around, surprised to hear the sound of Irene Rose's voice as he emerged from the factory. It had just turned 6. James the coachman beamed down at him. "Come on, young un, we can't be waiting here all night for thee." The lad returned his old friend's smile. "I didn't expect to see you here, James." He climbed into the trap next to Constance, his eyes twinkling a greeting to her. "How did your day go, Daniel?" she asked. "I'm working with William Mather. It's been very interesting and not quite what I expected." "You mean you're working in the office?" Irene Rose sounded surprised. "No, Aunt Rose, I'm working with young William, Mr. Mather's son. He's an apprentice as well. We're both under the supervision of an engineer, Bill Holland. William says Mr. Holland's a real craftsman, and I'll learn a great deal from him." "Oh, I see. We decided to pick you up this once, because we've been for a treat in town, and Constance couldn't wait to hear all about your first day at work." Constance shook her head, turned to Daniel and grinned. "Mother wanted to hear all about your day, Daniel." She leaned closer. "I just couldn't wait to see you," she confided in a whisper. Her hand moved to his as it lay on the edge of the leather-upholstered bench seat, where her mother couldn't see, although Irene Rose wouldn't have taken exception to this modest display of affection. Daniel felt quite grown up and rather flattered. "So, tell me all," Irene Rose said, confirming Constance's assertion that she was the one more interested in his day's work. "Well, I met old William Mather first thing this morning, and he seemed a very jolly kind of gentleman. Then they took me to see Mr. Holland and young William. William showed me various departments, including the foundry and machine shop, and finally the department where the textile printing machines are assembled. He explained to me in simple terms how they work. Then, in the afternoon, I was provided with a set of drawings, shown to a bench, and put to the task of making myself a set of tools." "Tools?" Irene Rose responded. "I could buy you a set of tools. What exactly do you need?" Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "No, Aunt Rose. Firstly, I have to make myself a set of spanners. The point is, by doing so, I learn how to mark out the metal plate they are made from, how to file accurately, and how to use simple machine tools such as a pillar drill. It's all part of the learning process. Once I've made them, they then have to be case hardened so they don't wear out, and I'll be shown how it's done. Again, I'll be learning as I go along. At the end of the process, I'll have a set of useful tools that should last a lifetime, and which I can take pride in every time I use them." Constance was evidently impressed by this reply, judging by the way she gave Daniel's hand a squeeze of approval. Damn you and the entire corporation." "What on earth's going on, Grace?" Irene Rose had just entered the house, having dropped Daniel off at home in Ancoats, although she'd first heard the sound of the argument outside in the street. "Your feyther's giving Alderman Davitt a roasting." She entered the library, Constance on her tail. Her father stood by the fireplace, red in the face and obviously angry. Alderman Davitt sat at the table, not looking happy. Mary Upton sat opposite, grim-faced. "What's the matter?" Mary Upton looked up at Irene Rose. 6 at mill workers' children didn't turn up at nursery this morning. They all live at the North End Ancoats. Their parents work at McConnell's mill. I sent Rosa to find out why the little uns hadn't come. There's cholera. We could be facing an epidemic. I went back with Rosa and we found one poor old woman dead in a cellar dwelling. Dr. Kay's there now with sanitation police. All children seem fine, but a number of parents are sick. Dr. Kay's managed to get them into the isolation hospital." Irene Rose sat down and looked at her father. She'd never seen him look so dejected. Over the last 10 years, he, with Daniel Akroyd Senior's assistance and advice, had spent time and money improving the houses of all his mill workers. They'd knocked 2 dwellings into one to provide more space for families, rebuilt walls, making all external walls double brick with air ventilation to combat damp, ensured roofs were in good condition, and made sure no cellars were sublet and used as habitations. In addition, Matthew had provided more privies and employed men to empty and clean them on a regular basis. At the same time, he fought a campaign along with Dr. Philip Kay to persuade the corporation to take responsibility for enforcing house improvements and to ensure the regular clearing and cleaning of the ash pits and middens that serve for human waste disposal, knowing full well that his fellow mill owners would not take their share of responsibility for their own workers' health. Indeed, he knew they saw his efforts as senseless, adding to his costs and therefore giving them a competitive edge. He knew because they'd told him to his face in no uncertain terms, and delighted in doing so, treating him with scorn. Now his own workforce once again faced a major killer disease on the rampage, despite his and their efforts to clean up the area and set an example to others. He'd argued the case for improvements in basic sanitation ever since the Manchester Municipal Borough Council had been constituted in 1838, following the Municipal Boroughs Act of 1835. Prior to that act, there were approximately 250 corporations in the country, all of which had received a royal charter at some time or another in the dim and distant medieval past. In all cases, their electorate was tiny and unrepresentative, and in 180 cases, the only people entitled to vote were the members of the corporation. In other words, they were local self-perpetuating dictatorships, virtually all controlled by the landed gentry via the Tory party. In theory, they were responsible for overseeing water supplies, drainage and street cleansing. In practice, they did little, apart from provide sinecures for family members and friends, and were rife with corruption. As the Royal Commission, whose findings resulted in the 1835 Act, concluded, the existing municipal corporations of England and Wales neither possess nor deserve the confidence or respect of your Majesty's subjects, and that a thorough reform must be enacted before they can become what we humbly submit to your Majesty they ought to be, useful and efficient instruments of local government. It then stated, corporation funds are frequently expended in feasting and in paying the salaries of unimportant officers. In some cases, in which the funds are expended on public works, an expense has been incurred beyond what would be necessary if due care had been taken. These abuses often originate in negligence, in the opportunity afforded of obliging members of their own body or the friends and relations of such members. Most towns didn't enjoy the status of corporations, and in effect had no formal local government until the 1835 Act made it possible for them to apply for recognition as a municipal borough. This had resulted in the most disastrous consequences for Manchester and its older but smaller sister Salford on the western bank of the Irwell, particularly in the field of public health. According to the local census of 1811, Manchester's population was some 89,000 souls. 10 years later, it was 126,000. By 1831, it had grown to 182,000. By 1841, some 236,000. And now, in 1851, it had reached the enormous figure of 303,382. Salford had witnessed even more rapid growth. In 1812 it had a population of just 12,000, but by 1840 this had increased to over 70,000, almost a six-fold increase in a mere 28 years. By 1851 it was estimated at well over 130,000. The 1835 Act had widened the electorate of the municipal corporations to include all males who own property subject to £10 or more in rates. Nonetheless, this still excluded virtually all working men, who, in the case of Manchester, comprised almost 90% of the total male adult population. The Act provided for elections to take place every 3 years, with 1/3 of the council standing for election each year. When Matthew had first entered into discussions with Councillor Davitt way back in 1839, he'd high hopes of speedy action, particularly in the form of improved sanitation and refuse disposal. There was no shortage of labour available and more than willing to undertake the dirtiest jobs, and the corporation was the tax-raising authority in the greatest single wealth-generating area of the British Empire. The provision of clean water, Matthew recognised, would take longer. The only sources of water for both Salford and Manchester were the rivers, principally the Irwell, the Irk and the Medlock, all of which were polluted as they continued to be used as open sewers, both for industrial and human effluent, as well as being the principal sources of drinking water. Despite his high hopes, Matthew remained a disappointed man. Virtually every elected councillor and all the aldermen, elected by the corporation from amongst their own members to serve for 6 years, were manufacturers or merchants, and all were supposed radicals. As such, they'd all stood on a platform for reform, for improved sanitation and clean water supplies. The vast majority had quite simply reneged on their promises, more interested in the prestige membership of the corporation provided than in doing a job for the people. Although they had to be Manchester ratepayers to be elected, this didn't mean they had to be Manchester residents, and most were not. They lived in the leafy, well-regulated garden suburbs outside the town. If they owned a mill, a factory or property within the town, on which they paid rates, they had the right to vote. The few that lived in Manchester tended to reside on the semi-rural and lofty heights of Cheetham Hill, or the better areas of Chorlton-upon-Medlock, around fashionable Plymouth Grove, well away from the slums of Little Ireland and Irish Town, or Little Italy, and other parts of Ancoats. In their case, they had 2 votes for the corporation, one for their residence and one for their business. Just as the radicals had abandoned the labouring poor after the Great Reform Act of 1832, and during and since their campaigns for the repeal of the Corn Laws, so they'd abandoned them once they had control of local government. It wasn't as though the Manchester manufacturers lacked civic pride. They had that in abundance. Unfortunately, their commitment and sense of duty to their workers did not match their pride. Civic and privately owned buildings in the commercial district provided due testimony to the fact. The Free Trade Hall, first erected on the site of Peterloo as a wooden building, had now been rebuilt in brick and stone and towered above Peter Street. The branch of the Bank of England in King Street was equally impressive, as were the large retail departmental stores and many of the wholesale warehouses used for the storage and display of cotton goods. One merchant of Matthew Etherall's acquaintance had just commenced building a new warehouse. James Watts had bragged it would be the largest wholesale drapery warehouse owned and solely occupied by one company in the whole of the world. It would take 5 years to build, and he'd earmarked £100,000 for its construction, a truly colossal amount of money. It was to be built in the style of a magnificent Venetian palace on Portland Street near Piccadilly, in rich golden sandstone imported from miles away. He described in great detail the wide, ornately decorated marble stairwell, around which grand staircases will provide his customers with access to its 5 stories. Each will be decorated in a different style: Italian Renaissance, Elizabethan, French Renaissance, and Flemish. At the very top of his palace, he planned roof pavilions featuring large Gothic wheel windows, the whole to be sumptuously decorated, and each floor to be equipped with the finest mahogany counters to display his wares. Matthew had known this man for many years. He started as a humble handloom weaver in Didsbury, and by the ruthless exploitation of other people's labour, the astute use of mechanisation, utilising other people's capital, and a love of cutthroat competition that amounted to an addiction, had become exceedingly rich. He now lived at Asbury Hall on the Cheshire bank of the Mersey, where he delighted in entertaining churchmen, politicians, and anyone with political and economic influence he could put to good use. His warehouse would be within a 10-minute walk of the 2 largest working-class slums in Europe, where poverty, destitution and disease were rife. Thankfully for Watt's customers, they were well hidden from sight. Matthew had met another manufacturer the previous week, a young German who had first come to Manchester in 1842 and who worked as a manager at Herman and Engels' mill in Salford. Frederick Engels was a bit of a revolutionary and a close friend of Karl Marx. His father, a partner in the Salford mill, had packed him off to England to keep him out of trouble, a rather forlorn hope, as it happened, as his experiences in Manchester and Salford only served to deepen his revolutionary convictions. Like Matthew, Fred had an interest in and a concern for the working class, and in particular their housing and health problems. He'd related to Matthew how shocking he'd found the state of Manchester's housing and its completely anarchic and unplanned nature when he'd first arrived in the town, saying he'd never come across such a place in all his extensive travels on the continent. He'd explained how he'd voiced his dismay to a fellow manufacturer at the time, an Englishman who had listened carefully, politely, and patiently to everything he had to say. At the end of the German's observations, the manufacturer simply stated, "And yet there is a great deal of money made here. Good morning, sir." This middle-class obsession with and the worship of money above all else, whilst completely ignoring the welfare of their fellow human beings, was the cause of Matthew's despair and anger, and David's discomfort. The latter had chosen this particular day to visit the Hedgerows to inform Matthew that the corporation, at long last, had decided to build a reservoir in the Longdendale Valley to pipe fresh water to the town, which would be available to the working classes via standpipes in every few streets or so, a major step forward. Naturally, David was sure this would impress, Manchester being the first borough to initiate a project to pipe water from outside its own boundaries, and it being a project the mill owner had advocated for years. He'd intended to secure Matthew's support for himself and his party at the next round of municipal elections on the basis of this positive development. Unfortunately for him, for he was by no means the worst of his class, he'd chosen the day of a new cholera outbreak in Ancoats close to Gibraltar Mill and the homes of its workforce to seek that support. An outbreak that would have been avoided if the corporation had spent a small amount of the ratepayers' money each week collecting and cleaning up the human excrement from the middens and ashpits and the pig shit from the courts, lanes and streets, as Matthew and Dr. Philip Kay had campaigned for over the previous 12 years. Irene Rose had quickly summed up the situation. "I think you'd best leave," she said to Alderman Davitt. "This household will be doing everything possible to expose you and your fellow councillors for the villains you are. I, for one, will be mounting a campaign by the working people of this town to force the corporation to commence doing the job it is supposed to do. You're elected to serve the people, not to serve your own narrow, selfish, profit-motivated interests. I'm ashamed to be a member of the same class as you. You're a bunch of vile, self-serving traitors to humanity. Close the door behind you." She walked over to her father, who had slumped into his armchair, looking dejected and forlorn. Constance sat down next to Mary, eager to assist. "I'd like to help out in the nursery tomorrow, Mary, if I may." The midwife looked into her earnest young face and smiled. "You're a good lass, Constance. I'm thinking we're going to need all the help we can get. Why do they keep murdering people, Mary? They murdered my Daniel's mother, and they murdered my mother and father, and now they're murdering more good people." "Nay, lass, it's no murder, it's disease. It's a law unto itself, it's an act of God. But they know why it happens, and they have the power to stop it. Dr. Kay's produced scores of reports about it. I've heard him talking to grandfather about it. It happens every summer." The youngster shook her head, looking at Mary wide-eyed. "It kills hundreds of people. They choose not to stop it. They'd rather people die than provide money. That makes it murder. They shouldn't blame God for something they've caused themselves by forcing people to live in poverty, overcrowded and filthy conditions. That's blasphemy, isn't it? That's what my Daniel says anyway." Although Constance didn't want to inform Mary, being loath to upset her, knowing the midwife was a practising Christian, for she regularly attended the Reverend Schofield's chapel on Every Street, Daniel had gone much further. He told Constance he believed God was a figment of the human imagination, and the manufacturers and others in power used the concept of a deity to escape their own obligations, blaming God for things which they, and they alone, were responsible for. Daniel had said if the God he'd read about in the Bible actually existed, he'd have treated the rich to a good dose of pestilence once in a while, instead of regularly afflicting the labouring poor with plagues of disease and death? Constance wasn't absolutely sure Daniel was right. She liked the idea of a benign supreme being looking down on the world and intervening every now and again to help people who really deserved help, and rewarding those who truly helped others by ensuring them a place at his side. However, she was beginning to realise if Daniel wasn't right, God must truly move in mysterious ways. She wondered if they had cotton mills in heaven. Perhaps Satan had been a mill owner before he fell from grace. Perhaps he still was a mill owner and lived in a mansion on the edge of town. She seemed to remember something about "suffer the little children to come unto me." She knew from what Amy Peduzzi had told her that the mill owners used to collect poor children from the workhouses and the orphanages, putting them to work without wages and making them suffer in all kinds of horrid ways. Was this what the Bible meant? She looked across the room at her grandfather, being comforted by her mother. She had a sudden urge to go and wrap her arms around him. Old Matthew wasn't like the rest of the mill owners. He was very, very special, and Constance was beginning to realise how much she loved him and how much she, Faith and Benjamin owed to him, irrespective of whether it was God, man, the economic system, or any combination of all three that had taken her parents away. Irene Rose, Matthew and Michael had provided Faith, Benjamin and herself with a family, a loving sister in the shape of little Bess, and a good home when they were in desperate need. They provided them with security and love, a stable base for a sound future when it had been most required and they were at their most vulnerable. They'd always treated them as their own children, in exactly the same way they'd treated Bess, not differentiating between them in any way. These were just some of the things Constance knew with absolute certainty. She wondered why such kind, caring and loving people should be so contemptuous of organised religion and be so dismissive of parsons and prelates. Maybe she should initiate some investigation and try to understand Daniel's atheism a little more. Chapter 4. Young Daniel Akroyd rose early on the Tuesday morning. By 5:25 he'd breakfasted on Waterloo porridge, enjoyed a cup of tea, and stole out of the house with his bag of baggins and his work apron, careful not to wake his father. It was raining. The dark gritstone slabs of the pavement glistened in the dim, early morning light. He pulled his felt hat over his eyes and vowed to save up for an oilskin cape, or one of the new rubber-coated garments invented by Macintosh, now being manufactured from waste material at Burley's mill by the Scot. He'd to be at his workbench by 6, and it was a good 1.5 miles away. All was quiet, save for the staccato noise of his own iron-shod clogs ringing out on the broken flags, and the occasional sound of others echoing in the distance. Apart from this, the sound of running water, dripping and gurgling, predominated. It dripped off cracked slates and blocked up gutters, gurgled down the outside and inside of broken drain pipes, dripped off the brim of his hat, soaking the shoulders of his fustian jacket and the knees of his trousers in the process. Above all, it dripped out of the sky in great big cold lumps of soot-laden acidic rain, dirtying and defiling everything it touched as it did so. He took great care to avoid the rotting vegetable matter on the pavement, not wishing to find himself flat on his arse. A typical Manchester autumn day, the lad thought to himself, and I'm not prepared. He made his way on to Great Ancoat Street. Past the junction of Oldham Street and Oldham Road, the highway narrowed to a lane, fronted by broken-down shops, with murky windows, and a couple of disreputable beerhouses. Turning down Shoedale, he noticed the gas lighting already lit in John Doherty's boot shop and coffee house, but there was no sign of Irene Rose's old mentor. The town was fast waking up, and his clogs were now just one pair out of many ringing out on the pavements. The rumble of ironclad wheels of carriers' carts, and the sound of heavy shiers' hooves on stone sets, echoing off the dirty brick walls lining the narrow streets, joined them as they ferried goods to and from the nearby Victoria station of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Company. Passing behind the old collegiate church, he took a short-cut through the churchyard. From here, Blackfriars Bridge would take him over the Irwell, its waters shrouded in fog, into Salford and on to Garden Lane and the Salford Ironworks. As he reached the bridge, for one eerie, ghostly moment, the piercing whistle of a steam locomotive banished all other sound. Daniel wasn't the only one up early that morning. Young Constance, who normally loved to lie in, and often only arose from her slumbers after Irene Rose had set young Bess and her comrade in arms, little Faith, to the task of rudely removing her eiderdown and soft lambswool blankets, was already having her breakfast, keen to get to Mary Upton's and assist in the nursery. James already had the pony and trap outside the stables waiting for her, although to be fair to Constance, she'd offered to walk to Ancoats. Grace had insisted it was too dangerous for the 12-year-old to be out so early on her own. Despite the girl's protest, she'd be 13 next May, and 12-year-old mill workers weren't mollycoddled. Grace smiled at her young mistress's use of this particular word, and wondered if she'd started taking language lessons from Bess, or if she'd picked it up from young Daniel. Either way, it was nice to hear her beginning to speak properly again. As a 3-year-old, when Constance had first moved into the family, she'd spoken the language of the poets as her first and only language, but over the years she'd taken on middle-class airs and graces, to the point where she had more airs than old Father Time had whiskers. "Good morning, Constance. What are you doing here so early in the day?" Rosa Joseph, obviously more than pleasantly surprised, beamed at the youngster as she wiped her hands on her clean white apron. "Mary Upton said she needed help, so here I am," Constance responded. "Good a girl. I'm on me own, apart from Bella and Amy. Mary's a-gone to see how some of the bambinos are. Have a cup of tea, and then we boil some more milk ready for the little uns." Amy Redbank, or rather Peduzzi, took a plate out of the sink and placed it on the draining board, picked up a towel and wiped the suds off her hands. "I'll pour the tea. I reckon we all need one." At that moment the sound of a baby crying emerged from Mary's living room. "That's a Lyle Job skriking," Rosa said. "He'll wake 'em all up." The Italian grabbed a titty bottle full of milk from the larder and quickly retreated into the nursery. Amy laughed before turning back to Constance. "Sit this hell down, Connie. It's good to see you, and we need your help in Mary being away. She's well fretting about this cholera. If it's not one thing come to mither us, it's t'other. What can I do to help, Amy? I'll do whatever I can." The young woman glanced up from pouring the tea, a mischievous smile briefly flitting across her face. "Art thou any good at changing and washing soiled thingamajigs?" she asked, straight-faced. "I do it all the time," Constance said with a grin. Amy knew it couldn't be true, but admired the youngster's attitude. The mill owner's granddaughter decided to have a word with Bella as soon as she finished her tea. Sure she'd have no problem removing a soiled thingamajig, or even washing it. The problem was replacing it. It had been a long time since Faith and Benjamin wore one, and when they'd moved to the Heatherose, Irene Rose had given the job to Michael. "Now then, young Daniel, how art thou doing?" "All right, I think, Mr. Mather." Daniel looked up from his vice and placed his bastard file on the bench, much surprised to hear his employer's voice, let alone his question. He looked at William quizzically. The manufacturer picked up one of the 2 finished spanners laid on the bench and examined it closely with a practised eye. It felt smooth to his grip and well balanced. "It's very handsome, Daniel, but they are spending a fair bit of time removing metal, aren't they?" He gazed at the lad, his face giving nothing away. Daniel wondered if he was being critical. Young William watched, wondering how Daniel would react. "I want to make them comfortable to use, Mr. Mather. That's why I'm taking care to round off all the sharp edges." "Aye, but it takes time, and time's money. My money. You could use gloves when thou art unfastening a difficult nut or bolt to protect your hands. Most workers are just chamfer th' edges and not round 'em off and put such high polish on their metal. They're only tools at the end of the day." Young William picked up the other spanner, examining it carefully. He liked what he saw, but didn't say a word, eager to hear Daniel's explanation. Wearing gloves doesn't allow the kind of delicate touch you need, Mr. Mather. They slow the job down, soon wear out, and gloves cost money, Daniel asserted quietly but firmly. I thought I'd better spend time now and make sure they're right. I'm going to have to use 'em for the rest of me working life. William Mather smiled. I bet our William put you up to this? Young William laughed. I didn't, feyther. I saw what Daniel was doing, and he were doing it right, so I left him to it. He brandished the other spanner in his hand. Daniel takes pride in his work, feyther, and I know how William examine the beauty of the line and curve, the combination of art with strength. If it looks right, it is right. You keep on telling me, and I'm sure you're right. You usually are. He put his hand on his son's shoulder, gripping it with obvious affection, and more than a touch of pride. Even if you are bloody annoying with it at times. He turned his attention back to Daniel. Good lad, me and thee'll get on right gradely. With that he turned on his heel and went to have a chat with Bill Holland. Young William grinned at Daniel. Me feyther's a man of few words, he informed his fellow apprentice, but he admires craftsmanship and hates yes-men and bullshitters. I reckon you passed the first test, Daniel Akroyd. You stuck by your guns in your own quiet way and told him why you were taking the trouble you were. Dad'll like that, even if it is costing him money. Daniel smiled and nodded, but remained silent, turning his attention back to the job in hand. Nonetheless, he had a warm glow inside. He was beginning to feel at home, and had the strong idea he and young William would become good mates. Not so bad, really, he thought. It was only his second day in the strange new world of work. Constance had also enjoyed her day. She'd always related well to younger children, and she'd had plenty of scope for displaying her talents at the nursery. The children ranged in age from a few weeks up to 4 years. From 4 years of age up to 15, the children now attended a school in a new outbuilding attached to Mary's Kitchen and funded jointly by Gibraltar Mill and the Co-op. To Rosa and Bella's delight, she carried out her fair share of thingamajig changing and washing, and proved she had a natural talent for entertaining the toddlers and other children. Irene Rose had turned up at 4 with the intention of taking her daughter home, thinking she'd be tired, but Constance had insisted on staying until the mill workers picked their children up in the evening. Daniel Akroyd Sr. had turned up at 6 to pick up food for young Daniel's evening meal, and Constance insisted they take him to his home in the Pony and Trap. Irene Rose had assumed Constance wanted to see Daniel, which of course she did, but she equally wished to visit their home and the area in which they lived, having never been in the house. Mary Upton had also returned. She'd been to the isolation hospital with Dr. K, and reported that the doctor felt they'd nipped the chance of a cholera epidemic in the bud. None of the children had developed any of the symptoms, and only 2 of the parents had displayed any sign of fever. Luckily, both enjoyed basic good health, and he was sure they'd recover. On Dr. K's orders, the sanitation police had thoroughly cleansed the cellar where the old woman had died and made it inaccessible. They'd inspected all the houses in the surrounding area, and the interior walls were now being lime-washed where necessary. Irene Rose, looking to the future, had an eye on the forthcoming municipal elections next spring. She'd asked Dr. K if he'd be willing to talk about the health issues involved and basic means of prevention workers in the area could take if she was to organise a series of public meetings. She'd told him she was sick and tired of the corporation's excuses, and intended to rally support to tackle the problems prevalent in the locality. The good doctor readily agreed and suggested he should draw leaflets providing advice on basic hygiene they could have printed and distributed. Although she didn't inform him at the time, she had plans to ensure the Chartists stood their own candidates in the elections. Irene Rose already had one supporter of the Charter in mind, a local ratepayer and therefore entitled to stand. Moreover, he was a highly successful and widely respected businessman, a man of principle she could trust implicitly, her own father. Thanks to the undemocratic multiple vote system for multiple properties subject to rate payments, 2 votes were in the bag already, his own. All she had to do was persuade him to stand. She decided to take the children into her confidence. Constance would no doubt be a major ally. She could wrap Matthew around her little finger. With young Bess and little Faith as part of the team, the outcome was obvious. Chapter 5. Don't you think you should talk to me about it? William Mather sat at the dining room table, his head in his hands. He looked up at his wife. Amelia smiled back at him. You look as though you've all the worries of the world on your plate. What's the matter, love? Surely it's not that bad. Bill Holland, that's what the matter is. He can be so bloody stupid at times, and that's swearing. Amelia laughed. Well, it's not exactly the first time I've heard you swear, and I dare say it won't be the last. What's Bill been up to? He's rallying union members for strike action. Bill Holland organising a strike? What have you done, William Mather? Bill wouldn't do that unless it was serious, or he was absolutely desperate. That's it, I haven't done anything. It's rest of bloody engineering employers. They've decided to wage war on union before it gets too powerful. They're out to break it. Amelia listened patiently as her husband explained. It was now 1852. The Amalgamated Society of Engineers had been in existence for just 12 months, but its membership was growing, and growing fast. Essentially, it had the employers worried, not because it was particularly militant. Indeed, its leadership comprised moderate men committed to negotiation and the power of reason, but rather because of its potential strength. Up to that point in time, trade union organisation of any significance in the north of England tended to be confined to the cotton and silk textile workers of South East Lancashire and North East Cheshire, and the woolen industry workers of the West Riding of Yorkshire, plus the workers in the coalfields. The latter's organisation tended to be weaker than the former. Unlike the mill workers, miners lived and worked in small, isolated rural villages, and often in remote and disparate areas. The colliers' trade union organisation reflected this geographical situation, and it too tended to be fragmented and localised. At first, the workforce in the engineering industry comprised highly skilled craftsmen, all of whom had served apprenticeships in increasingly specialised crafts and trades, as the division of labour modern manufacturing required proceeded apace. Their skills were in great demand, and therefore commanded higher wages. They had stood aloof from trade union organisation. When they did form unions, they did so on a craft basis. Like the miners, this often left them fragmented and weak, although they didn't face the disadvantage of geographical isolation. As the Industrial Revolution gathered pace and momentum, the engineering industries grew rapidly. The factory system, the increasing use of machinery, and the replacement of water power by steam power, the rapid development of new technology, the growth of the railways, and the increased market for metal goods meant the demand for metal workers often outstripped supply. It took time to train an engineer, and they required a higher level of education than other workers. They had to be able to understand and sometimes prepare an engineering drawing, and they had to be able to read and write. Often they designed the product they were required to manufacture, and had to solve complex structural problems. In the case of the textile finishing machinery the Mathers produced, its leading engineers, such as Bill Holland, also required a detailed knowledge of dyes and industrial chemistry, as well as expertise in mechanical engineering. As a result, over the decades, engineering workers had not suffered the same degree of wage cuts, short-time working, layoffs and unemployment as textile and other workers. They were rightly regarded as the aristocracy of labour, or rather they had been. The only constant thing in life is change, and they were not immune to the basic economic rules of laissez-faire capitalism. Engineering employers adhered to the philosophy buy cheap and sell dear, with a tenacity equal to that of the most grasping mill owner. With the introduction of ever more sophisticated machine tools, standardized screw threads, and interchangeable parts, through the pioneering work of people like the engineer Joseph Whitworth, their work too was being de-skilled. The law of supply and demand switched the balance of power in their employers' favour. The ASC, with its democratic structures based on local branches, a nationally elected leadership, district committees and officials, and annual policy-making national conference, provided an inevitable and increasingly attractive method of curtailing the threat of growing competition between individual workers to accept cuts in wages, working and living conditions. Trade unions were still technically illegal in the sense they were outside of and not protected by the law, but were no longer criminal organisations as they'd been under the Combination Acts. Nonetheless, they were rightly seen by the masters as a threat to their mastery and their right to manage, a euphemism for their right to impose a dictatorship within the workplace, just as they sought to impose their political dictatorship through their increasing control of local and parliamentary government. Faced with a rapidly growing union, the engineering employers, organised nationally through their Parliamentary Committee, had decided to embark on a campaign to smash the Amalgamated Society of Engineers before it could get off the ground. Selected firms would impose wage cuts, which they knew the union would have no alternative but to resist. They'd then respond by locking the workers out of the factories, provoking others into strike action in support of their fellows. They reckoned the union would soon be bankrupted, its members forced back to work, broke, defeated, demoralised, and only too willing to accept the employer's terms, which were to include a signed declaration they'd resign from the Amalgamated Society of Engineers and not join or form any other union. On learning of this, William sought out his friend and key engineer, Bill Holland, to discuss the matter. The last thing he needed was lost production. To his dismay, Bill made it clear he'd help form the ASC, and, if such a policy was pursued by the employers in Manchester and Salford, he'd personally make it his business to ensure not a single engineering factory would be left unscathed. If and you buggers declare war on us, I'll do everything in my power to ensure every factory's bloody idle, including this and William Mather, had been his precise and extremely blunt words. Bill was a man of principle and didn't like yes-men or bullshitters any more than his employer did. As soon as her husband had informed her of this, Amelia had laughed aloud again, much to William's discomfort. "Quite right too," she said. "Good for Bill. I reckon I'd say exactly the same. Bloody hell, woman, don't you start. I've important orders to deliver and deadlines to meet. Then you should use the sense the good Lord provided you with. Initiate some serious talks with Bill and the rest of your workforce, and maybe you should try and talk some sense into your fellow employers. From what you've said, they're the cause of your problems, not Bill Holland, your workers, the union, or anybody else for that matter. I've a good mind to bloody well sack Bill, that'll nip it in bud." "Sack Bill? Oh, my dead body, and I'll get young William against you. We'll both joint strike and we'll involve the servants. You'll be cooking your own tea and washing and mending your own clothes." "Oh, William thinks the world of Bill. He's the one who got the lad enthusiastic and excited about engineering in the first place. You owe Bill a lot." She gazed into her husband's eyes. "I'd also remind you, William Mather, Colin and you wouldn't have a business now if it weren't for Bill Holland. You'd have been looking for a job as a manual worker if it hadn't been for him." She shook her head, defying him to contradict her. "Next time he gets you out at Middin won't be first. Go and talk to him, and do it now. I'll come with you if you want." She weighed her husband's reaction. All the bluster had disappeared. He appeared deflated, hopeless and helpless. William had every right to feel that way because everything Amelia said was all too true, and he knew it. It was Bill who'd enthused young William. He first introduced the lad to the Mechanics' Institute before he started work. It was Bill who convinced the lad the best preparation for following in his father's footsteps and becoming a partner in the business was to become an apprentice working on the shop floor at the cutting edge of the enterprise. In fact, it was Bill who had first convinced the Mathers, both Colin and himself, they should be financial patrons of the Mechanics' Institute, and thus outplace what was to become Manchester's premier centre of industrial and scientific learning and training on a sound foundation. "Maybe I should go on my own. I'll organise the pony and trap. Is he still living near the Crescent?" "He's not at home," her husband informed her. "He's with our William. They're working on some new idea they've got. They're at Mechanics' Institute with young Daniel." "There you are," she declared triumphantly. "Bill Holland's not fit to burn one minute. Next you're telling me he's helping our William and young Daniel in his own free time. You haven't the sense you were born with, William, mother, and that's a fact. Get your coat on. I've changed my mind. You're coming with me, like it or not." With that she left the room to grab a coat and bonnet and retrieve William's hat and coat. William breathed a deep sigh, mopped his furrowed brow with his pocket handkerchief, stood up, looked in the mirror over the fireplace, and smiled at his own reflection. If anybody could sort things out, Amelia could. When he'd married his childhood sweetheart, he thought he'd have a dutiful wife who'd rear his children and organise their domestic affairs, whilst he got on with the job of running the business and bringing home the cash. She'd done everything he'd asked, and done it admirably well, but like Bill Holland, Amelia was full of surprises, and nobody's fool. Amelia had taken the initiative of placing young William under Bill Holland's wing. She'd been worried her eldest son was in danger of taking their wealth for granted, and might fall into the trap of thinking he could become a gentleman of leisure. Amelia came from good working-class stock, and she'd never allowed herself to forget it, nor anybody else for that matter, not least her husband. At that moment, Matthew Etherall's coachman, James, brought the pony and trap to a halt outside the Theatre Royal, having enjoyed a quiet pint of beer at the circus on Portland Street. Irene, Rose and Constance were enjoying an evening at the theatre, and James had to take them home. However, Irene, Rose and Constance had decided to make a slight diversion. Both wished to have a word with young Daniel Akroyd, and were intent on picking him up from the mechanics to provide him with a lift to Ancoats. Thus, two rather formidable women, one the daughter of a highly successful cotton mill owner, and the other the wife of a leading engineering factory owner, were destined to meet for the first time in years. At the same time, Constance would come into contact with a rather remarkable and attractive young man, who had the advantage over Daniel Akroyd of being 12 months younger, and therefore closer to her own age, as well as coming from a rather wealthy background. "There you are, Daniel." Irene, Rose and Constance had stepped through the impressive doors of the Mechanics' Institute on Cooper Street as Daniel, Bill and William were about to leave. "Hello, Connie and Rose. I didn't expect to see you here. Is something the matter?" Before they replied, he remembered his manners. "This is Mr. Holland, and this is William Mather," he said rather formally. He turned to his work colleagues. "This is my aunt, Irene Rose, and Constance, her daughter." The introductions made, Irene Rose held out her hand. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Holland. Daniel's always talking about you and young Mr. Mather." She smiled and they shook hands all round. This delay was rather lucky, not least from William and Amelia Mather's point of view, because if it hadn't taken place, Bill Holland and their son would have been on their way back home to Salford, and their journey wasted. As it happened, their pony and trap was pulling in behind the hedgerows as the introductions were coming to a conclusion. Now it was young William's turn to be surprised. He was an independent young man and didn't like the idea of not being trusted with making his own way home. "Why on earth are you here, Mother?" "I've come to see Bill. He and your father need to talk." She looked Bill Holland in the eye as her husband stood behind her looking slightly sheepish. "With due respect, Mrs., Bill Holland responded politely, "if the husband wishes to speak to me, he can ask for a meeting in his own time. He knows where I'll be at 6 tomorrow morning." Intrigued, to say the least, Irene Rose's well-owned political instincts informed her not to leave. It sounded like there might be trouble at the mill, or at least the Salford Ironworks. "Less of the missus, Bill Holland," Amelia retorted. "We've been on first-name terms for at least 20 years. Don't you start being obstinate as well. I've told William I'm not having it, and I'm telling thee the exact same message." Amelia turned to Irene Rose. "Men, what would you do with them? They both need their heads knocking together." Irene Rose decided to attempt to defuse the situation. She knew William Mather Sr. He'd supplied her father with textile machinery in the past and occasionally been a guest in her home, although it had been a long time since she'd met his wife. She turned to him. "Good evening, Mr. Mather. It's good to see you." "And you, Miss Rose. I just wish circumstances were more auspicious," he replied resignedly. "May I suggest we retire to more comfortable and private surroundings?" she asked diplomatically. "The York Hotel is just around the corner, and they provide an excellent Darjeeling. All kinds of problems can be solved over a nice cup of tea, don't you think?" Amelia looked at her, obviously surprised. "Whatever must you think of me?" she responded, holding her hand out. "Are you Irene Rose Heathrow, Matthew's daughter?" Irene Rose took the hand and shook it, laughing as she did so. "I wasn't much older than Constance when we last met, but I'm now married. My surname's O'Donnell." "Well, Irene Rose, it was a long time ago." She gazed into the younger woman's eyes. It must have been all of 20 years since she'd seen her friend's daughter, who she thought must now be in her very early 30s. "You know, it's so good to see you, Rose. You look just like your dear mother. She always was good looker amongst us mill lasses." She shook her head as if she couldn't quite believe her eyes, before drawing herself back to the business at hand. She placed her arm firmly in the crook of Bill's. "Right, Bill. You can escort me quick as you like, and my William can escort Miss Rose. If she's out like her mother, we'll soon have this pickle sorted." With that she set off, half cajoling and half pulling a much bemused and increasingly compliant Bill Holland along with her. Constance, young William, and Daniel, none of whom had a clue what was going on and were all agog, followed on close behind, whilst Irene Rose and William Sr. brought up the rear. Matthew Heathrow sat in his library in Hardwick Green. He'd helped Grace put Bess, Faith and Benjamin to bed, begun to read a book, and was now highly agitated. Grace had only recently asked him if he required anything, and he'd said he thought he should wait until Irene Rose and Constance returned. At that point he'd looked at the grandfather clock and realised just how late it was. He'd confided his worry about the lateness of the hour to Grace, but the maid assured him everything would be fine. After all, James had gone to meet them, and he was a reliable old fellow. "I bet they've gone to see young Daniel," Grace had pointed out. "They'll have taken lad home and be gossiping with him and his father." Matthew had nodded agreement. It was Daniel's regular night at the mechanics, and Irene Rose did have to pass it on the way home from the theatre. He told Grace she could retire for the night. If he needed anything, he knew where the kitchen was. She in turn had grinned, thanked him, and wished him good night. Matthew had returned to his book, but couldn't concentrate, beginning to worry all the more. He stood up, ready to start pacing back and forth in front of the fireplace, as he was prone to do in such circumstances. He heard the sound of the key in the lock of the front door, relaxed and sat down again, only to stand up once more as his son-in-law entered the room, alone. "Are you all right, Matthew? You look worried, so you do," Michael O'Donnell inquired. "Irene Rose and Constance aren't back from the theatre yet. It's gone 10 o'clock. The Irishman smiled and shook his head. "I'm sure they'll be fine, Matthew. You shouldn't worry. Irene Rose is a big girl now." His wife's laugh interrupted them. "I'm not that big," she said, surprising both as she entered the room. "How did you get in? I've been worried sick. Where have you been?" Matthew's agitation didn't seem lessened by her sudden appearance. "Through the front door and to the theatre, but not in that particular order. Why have you been worried? Where's Constance?" "She's in the kitchen making a pot of tea. What's all this about?" Matthew sat down again. "You said you'd be home by 9:30 and it's now 10:15. Constance should be in bed fast asleep." Irene Rose laughed at his unnecessary concern. "William Mather and Amelia send their regards," she responded. "They're visiting for dinner on Saturday evening, accompanied by their son. Young Daniel will attend as well." "Oh," Matthew replied, "that's nice, but how did you meet them, and why are you so late?" I've been mediating along with Amelia Mather to prevent unnecessary industrial action, Irene Rose replied, smiling somewhat mysteriously. Ah, here's Constance with the tea, just in time. Matthew looked at Michael as Irene Rose rallied to her daughter's assistance. Michael shrugged his shoulders, indicating he knew nothing, which of course he didn't. Like Matthew, he was ignorant of any planned industrial action. All was quiet for once as far as he was aware. He'd attended a meeting with John Doughty and James Leach earlier in the evening to discuss the printing of election leaflets. If anybody had advance warning of impending trouble, within or without the textile industry, it would be them. Neither had said anything. Irene Rose was either exaggerating or was privy to information others weren't. Knowing his wife, the Irishman was sure it would be the latter, and she'd soon share her knowledge. Michael proved to be quite right. Once the tea had been poured, Irene Rose informed them of the engineering employer's plan to break the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, and its potential effects on the relations between the Mathers and their employees, in particular those between Bill Holland and William Sr. Both Matthew and Michael knew the two men had enjoyed a good working relationship and a close friendship over many years. She related how Amelia had asked Bill and her husband if either welcomed the prospect of a dispute. After much huffing and puffing, the brandishing of fine statements of principle and preening of feathers, both admitted they didn't. Amelia argued they were allowing themselves to be swept along by a tide of events that wasn't of their making or of their choosing, and they shouldn't allow themselves to be put in that position. If you fell in the Irwell, you wouldn't let yourself be swept into the Mersey and out to sea, would you? She'd asked. You'd swim and make your way to the safety of the bank, or at least try to. That's what you have to do now. You can allow yourselves to be swept along by the current and drown, or you fight and resist. She'd locked on to her husband's eyes. You're an employer, William, but your fellows are adopting a course that's morally wrong, she'd said. You have to make a stand and break with them. Your workforce has stuck by you through thick and thin, but there's more to it than that. It's not in your customers' interests, and it's not in your interests. Fail to deliver your orders, and you could be bankrupt, and bankrupt pretty quick. You need to fulfill your obligations, and make sure your current orders go out on time. I know, I've seen the books. I can get a job in a mill, but what would you do? You'd be competing with Bill and all the rest for a job back on the shop floor, with an employer that's not half the man or engineer you are, and who delight in constantly humiliating you. Once she'd managed to focus their attention on the real problem, how they were going to react to the events about to be unleashed upon them, the two men hammered out a plan. William agreed to address a meeting of his employees and make it clear he'd no objection to any of them being a member of a union, that he didn't agree with either the aims or the methods of those employers wishing to break the ASE, to force strikes or implement lockouts, and he would not be involved. Bill in turn agreed to do his best to convince the workforce not to take strike action, but show solidarity with their fellow union members by setting up and donating to a strike fund and in any other ways open to them. If any marches or demonstrations were organised in support of the union, they should participate, but obviously not be paid for time off. They'd also ensure essential work in the factory was carried out in such circumstances. Bill and William agreed to keep each other informed of any new developments. Once the two had made up, reached agreement and sealed it with a handshake, Amelia said she thought the company should consider donating to the strike fund anonymously, and she intended to raise the question with her brother-in-law, Colin, the senior partner. She asked Bill not to mention this in his discussions with his workmates, firstly because she may not be able to win Colin's agreement, and secondly because she didn't want the workforce to see it as a bribe. On that basis, the party split up, Bill Holland and young William travelling back to Salford in the Mathers pony and trap, whilst Irene Rose and Constance gave Daniel a lift back to Ancoats. As soon as his daughter had concluded her explanation of events, Matthew asked, "When's all this due to take place?" Irene Rose admitted William Mather didn't know. "So it may not happen. The employers have agreed a policy, but not a timetable for its implementation?" Irene Rose nodded, but pointed out William Mather was sure the employers would carry out their plan. "Right," Matthew said. "The first thing we need to do is write a letter informing David Morrison of what we know. And Michael needs to start warning all his trade union colleagues first thing tomorrow. The ASC is going to need support. Forewarned is forearmed, and the first priority is to start raising funds. Once they lock workers out, they'll keep them out to the point of starvation. If the engineering employers are serious and can maintain any degree of unity between themselves, this will be the biggest industrial dispute since the 1842 strike, and it could be potentially disastrous for other industries." "Why, grandfather?" Constance wanted to know. "Because machinery wears out, Constance, my love. It breaks down and needs maintaining. That's why we lubricate it and keep it clean and employ maintenance engineers to look after it. Essential parts have to be replaced before they wear out, and without engineers and the engineering industry, there is little anybody can do. In this day and age, without machines, we can't produce textiles or anything else for that matter. We can't maintain the railways or transport goods. Serious issues are at stake which have ramifications well outside the engineering industry." Constance nodded her head, and then thought for a moment before asking her next question. "If the masters paid the same attention to their workers' needs as they care for their machines, wouldn't the world be a better place, grandfather?" Both Matthew and Michael laughed at this succinct and accurate observation, masquerading as a question from an innocent abroad. Irene Rose looked at her daughter, more than pleasantly surprised. She'd always been careful not to impose her own views on her children, but Constance was at a stage in life where she was seeing the world anew. She also seemed to be asking the right questions, and beginning to reach what Rose thought were positive conclusions, no doubt, at least partly, through young Daniel's influence. "A good point, extremely well made, Constance," she replied encouragingly, "but I think it's well past your bedtime, young lady. You've had a busy day. It's time to dream of Daniel." "Don't you think young William Mather's rather attractive, mother?" she responded. "I'll be up early in the morning. I'm going to help in the nursery again." She rose from her seat and walked over to Matthew, put her arms around him and kissed him on the cheek. "Good night, grandfather. Don't stay up too late. Sleep tight. Watch the bugs don't bite." Having repeated this nightly ritual with her father and mother, she took herself off to bed, leaving Irene Rose to wonder about her reference to young William.